Welcome to Insights for IT Negotiations, a podcast by UpperEdge, a leading IT sourcing, negotiation, and project execution advisory firm. I'm John Belden, UpperEdge's Chief Research and Strategy Officer.
And I'm Kylie Chisholm, UpperEdge's Marketing Manager. Join us every other week as we share insights to help you maximize the value of your key IT relationships. In each episode, we'll delve into the topics that matter most to IT decision makers and sourcing professionals. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Insights for IT Negotiations podcast. We have a really interesting episode this week. It is just John and I here chatting about more AI developments. And specifically, we are talking about generative AI infrastructure and the platforms that are supporting that infrastructure. So just a little bit of setup into why we are chatting about this today, what value you'll get from it. We saw a lot last year and then the first half of this year, companies doing proof of concepts with Gen AI projects. We've talked about that a lot on this very podcast and when we were doing the Sourcing Enterprise AI podcast. So now that we are in the second half of 2024, about to enter Q4 very shortly of 2024, and as we get into 2025, a lot of companies will start to scale up that infrastructure in support of the deployment of generative AI. Which is a very exciting time, but obviously that means we should be chatting about the infrastructure and the platforms that are supporting it so that as your company starts to evaluate those different providers, you know how to approach them in a thoughtful manner. So that's sort of the framework. John, do you have anything to add in terms of the tee up for this conversation?
No, Kylie, I think you did a great job there, but I will say good morning.
Good morning. So I guess just jumping right into it. Clearly, I'm ready to jump right into it.
Yes, obviously you're ready to go today.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. I got my coffee in me and let's get chatting. So we're going to start with the generative AI platform frameworks. So first, I know there's a couple of components that go into an effective AI platform. So can you just lay the groundwork of what those components are?
Yeah. So let's think about this. One of the things that's been interesting to me is, obviously because of my gray hair, you can tell that I've spent a lot of time within industry. But this is the generative AI infrastructure platform is a new platform. And with that new platform comes, I'll call it new terminology. And you have to be able to in order to be able to discuss the platforms, we've got to build a framework to say, how are we going to talk about these things? Because there's so many different components associated with an AI infrastructure platform. So at a high level, right, let's break it down into 5 basic components, and then maybe we can go into each one of those components. The first component is going to be tools associated with development of models themselves, right? That's kind of the core of what your infrastructure is supposed to, your AI infrastructure does, is it helps you, I'll call it, create and then serve these models. So component number 1, model development and training. The second component then is when you're thinking about these models and how you're going to train those models, all training is dependent on the data itself that you're going to use to train. So there's a whole set of tools associated with data. And then after you've developed those models, there's something that's called inference, which is how people are actually going to use those models in production, right? So there's a whole set of tools associated with managing the models when they're in production. And then the fourth component would be integration capabilities of those models. How can you talk specifically to those models from other pieces of your infrastructure? And then the final piece would be, okay, now you've got this entire environment that's I'll call it constructed to build models and I'll call it inference models and integrate models. How are you going to manage that entire environment? So we're going to refer to that as the ML ops and the governance tools associated with these platforms.
Awesome. Yeah. And so that was a great, high level overview. So I think now let's dig a little bit deeper into each of those components and chat about them a little bit. Starting with that data management and quality. How exactly does that fit into an overall platform at a deeper level?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about the data management and the quality, and we'll say that's kind of your starting point now, because you've got to be able to manage your data before you actually construct your models. Uh,
Hmm.
there's four components to that, at least from the framework that we've constructed. There's four components to that. There's, I'll call it, data ingestion, which is how you're going to bring your data into the platform to be able to begin with in the first place, right? How are you going to access that data in order to be able to actually use it effectively in order to be able to actually build your model?
Hmm.
Then there's what I'll refer to as data pre-processing tools. These are the tools that you use in order to be able to cleanse that data to get it ready for ingestion into the model. And then there's a set of tools, I'll call it, for governing that data, managing that data, the security, the privacy, etc., as well as how are you going to continuously manage the quality of that data. So, in many respects, it's a lot of the same tools that you would be thinking about if you were developing an ERP system and you're actually getting ready to load the data into an ERP system. Many of the same tools apply, just in a
Hmm.
different environment.
Interesting. Yeah. And then going into the model development and training. So now you have that data, you have sort of the foundation that you need. What does the model development look like?
Yeah, so when we're talking about model development, and this is one of those areas where if you're doing your own, your own M, if you're doing your own large model development on your own and trying to construct these things, this is a really important section, right? Because this is where you're going to have some level of compute intensity, and you're going to spend a lot of money if this is what your business is developing these large language models. So you're going to be thinking about, are there tools in the platform associated with how I'm going to manage these libraries and how I'm going to manage, I'll refer to it as the frameworks in order to be able to build the large language model. So now we're talking about terminology and technology like TensorFlow and
Hmm.
PyTorch and others. There's a whole, I'll call it, framework associated with how do you actually build large language models. Then there's tools associated with, I'll call it, customizing the models that have already been built, training infrastructure, meaning how am I going to train my models? How am I going to adjust I'll call it, my models? And then automated machine learning. These are the tools, I'll call it, that are really sophisticated from the standpoint of developing models themselves.
Hmm.
And I would say, by and large, the correlation to this would be, um, in an ERP environment, this is the customization of ERP. And I think most companies are probably going to not necessarily be developing their own large language models, but I think a lot of companies are going to be, I'll call it, um, let's let they're going to be modifying large language
Mm.
models or tuning those large language models in order to be able to be more applicable to their particular environment, and that's where these model development tools and training come in.
Gotcha. So they won't be, creating it from scratch, but they'll be taking the framework of the large language models that already exist and manipulating them for their needs.
Yeah, exactly, and adjusting those. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
I think ultimately that's where this whole industry is going to end up. There's probably only five companies out there in the world that are going to have ultimately the capacity to
Hmm.
develop large language models that are used throughout the industry. And
Yeah.
we're talking about the Microsofts, we're talking about the Googles, we're talking about the AWSs, right? Those are the
Yeah.
companies that are going to have the resource capacity and the monetary capacity, let's call it, in order to be able to spend time developing these things. Because, from what I've read and what I've heard, some of these large language models cost over $1 billion to actually create, right?
Wow.
So not many
Yeah.
companies are going to have the, I'll call it, the capacity to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So now we have the model developed going into the inference and the actual deployment of that generative AI. So what's that going to look like?
Yeah. So on this one, I would say for our clients,
Hmm.
um, this is probably the most important piece of the infrastructure when we think about it from the standpoint of managing costs going forward. Um, when you're actually using these models and people are interacting with the models, that's what's called inferencing, right?
Hmm.
And the inferencing itself uses compute capacity. And by and large, when you deploy a model in your organization or you serve it up as a part of a product or your own website, right? The inferencing is what's driving usage and what's actually driving costs. So there's a whole set of tools out there associated with how do you actually do real-time inferencing? How do you do your batch inferencing if it's coming from another system? And how do you do model optimization, right? Because model
Mhm.
optimization is what's going to allow you to a certain extent, control, right, the output of the model and how much it's going to actually drive or do inferencing, or, try to decide while it's going through the process to come back with an answer and how many CPUs it's actually going to employ and generate. So
Mhm.
it's an area I think that's going to be most important when you're doing your selection of your platform and you're doing your negotiations. That's an area to pay real attention to.
Yeah, for sure. And then moving into ML ops and governance, I know this is the place that I'm the fuzziest, so I'm very excited to hear more about how this works.
Yeah, so when we're talking about ML ops and governance, right? I'm gonna come back and say, okay, this is this is for new tools for an old concept. Okay,
Hmm.
um, you know the when you're building models, um, just like a system, just like anything else, you've got to worry about version control, right? And when we're thinking about version control, think about these models as being constantly updated as you're training the models, as you're adjusting the models, as you're tuning the models, right? You're going to constantly be evolving those models. And as you do this, just like anything else, just like any big platform, you've got to be able to manage those models to be able to say, I'm on this version, I'm on this version, I'm on this version, because you need some level of traceability associated with that. I think from the standpoint of audit compliance, this is a really important tool set on how you're
Hmm.
ultimately going to manage your environment itself.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. And then last, we have integration capabilities. So do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, so the integration capabilities, and this is one, again, I think it's an interesting one from a platform selection point of view. You're going to want to be able to think about how you're going to ultimately, when you deploy your large language models, you want to be able to think through how am I going to interconnect those with my other systems? Am I going to
Hmm.
be serving this up through an SAP environment, an Oracle environment? Am I building my own platform? Am I going to be doing custom development in the future? If I'm going to be doing custom development that accesses an MLL, then you're going to want to be able to think through how am I going to integrate this platform into the rest of my architecture. And so, we'll talk
Hmm.
about three things there, right? There's API integration. So, API is the ability to actually, let's call it, serve up the response and interact with an MLL or a large language model, serve that up just straight through kind of a standard connection. Then there would be data integration to say, do I want my large language model, to be able to access dynamically, right, my data warehouses to do the work, which is kind of another way of thinking about integration. And then the last component would be interoperability, which means how am I going to connect my large language models to my other standard platforms like an Oracle, like an SAP, like maybe Microsoft Dynamics? How am I going to connect my environment to those standard environments? And are there already standard APIs that I should be
Hmm.
building to? So all of those go into kind of thinking about what it is that I want to have in a platform for, I'll call it, my large language models.
Did you know that UpperEdge offers subscription advisory services? This on demand solution provides essential benchmarks and market insights specific to your business needs precisely when you need it, empowering you and your team to make informed decisions for your IT initiatives. Position your team for success. Reach out today via the link in the show notes to learn more. Awesome. So now we have the components of generative AI platforms. We have the framework to work off of. I know there are sort of six main providers of generative AI platforms. I know there's three that you especially want to really dive into. So I guess could you walk us through each of the providers, and then for those three that you want to, sort of double tap on, give us the high level strengths and weaknesses and just like a brief summary of what they are, what they bring to the market.
Yeah. So when we think about this, the AI infrastructure, and I'm glad you mentioned there was six. I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that will dabble in this AI infrastructure. Two of them, I'm going to say, two of them currently today constitute about 50% of the market for these, and that would be Amazon's AWS SageMaker and
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft's Azure AI. Those
Mm-hmm.
two tools, I'll call it, and it makes sense, right? Because that's where people have primarily their cloud infrastructure today.
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of safety associated with going those with those tools, and if that's where my cloud infrastructure is, perhaps there's I'll call it an economic play there that says I can work with these companies to get a better discount. Then the remaining set of companies, let's call it the second tier that make up another 30% of the market, would include Nvidia, who
Mm-hmm.
is, the chip maker Nvidia. They're beginning to play a bigger role in this space. Google Cloud. So, two firms that are primarily infrastructure firms. And then there's two firms, Snowflake and Databricks, which
Mm-hmm.
are much more along the lines of the actual data management itself, and manipulating the data. So they're primarily centered around, I'll call it, data management, and then moving into ML. The other
Mm-hmm.
companies are primarily infrastructure that are moving into ML.
Mm-hmm.
The three I want to talk about, though, are AWS, Microsoft, and NVIDIA.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too that you bring up how, to your point, a lot of companies are established with Microsoft and AWS. So in my marketing brain, I find it interesting to see how Databricks and Snowflake and Nvidia will make themselves stand out amongst the sort of big dogs in the industry that already have so much customer loyalty. Because I think you're exactly right that customers will feel very comfortable sticking with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was when I was a young kid, right? I mean, in growing up in the IT world, the joke was
Hmm.
always, you if you go with IBM, you can't be wrong, right? Because
Hmm.
IBM was the big player back in the 1980s, and kind of the sense was if you make the IBM decision, you're not going to be criticized by your senior management team. This is kind of
Yeah.
the same. This is kind of in the same category right now. If you make the decision to go with AWS or you make the decision to go with Microsoft, right? It's a strategically safe decision.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. So, like you said, we want to double tap on AWS, NVIDIA, and Microsoft. So, let's start with AWS, go through some of the strengths and weaknesses of that individual platform, and then we can do a little comparison between those three once we've sort of laid that groundwork.
Yeah, so as we think about AWS, the term that you're going to hear there, and the product that you're going to hear there is SageMaker.
Hmm.
SageMaker kind of goes throughout all of those. I'll call it all of those categories that we talked about, right? So for data, Sage Management has ground truth. For model development, there's something that's called Comprehend. There's real SageMaker real time inference. So SageMaker itself is the brand of tools in the AWS space, specifically um, for SageMaker. I think what you're
Hmm.
thinking about here and where um, AWS is going to, I'll call it, differentiate themselves is in two areas, right? One is it's going to be in scalability, and effectively they're coming here saying, hey, you can go up and down in terms of the use of the tool set based upon whatever you need, right? So it's not necessarily going to be, oh, I'm paying for a license and that's a fixed price throughout the entire use of that license. They're effectively saying, hey, you can use our tools, you can scale up, you can scale down. The other thing that they're going to focus on, or that they focus on, is integration with all of the other AWS services. So if AWS is your cloud platform, right? Then they're basically saying, hey, go with SageMaker because it's going to integrate with all of the other services that you have, making it a lot easier to integrate with the rest of, I'll call it, your company. And I think that's one of the reasons that obviously SageMaker is got the market share, is because of the dominance of AWS in terms of managing the cloud infrastructure.
So now moving into Nvidia, can you talk to us a little bit about their technology?
Yeah. So if we go to Nvidia, now Nvidia is primarily a chip maker. Um, and what makes Nvidia really interesting to me is, and I'm going to go back to how they're differentiating themselves currently
Hmm.
from um, Microsoft and AWS.
Hmm.
Nvidia is offering an enterprise license or a subscription license,
Hmm.
and effectively, based upon the current information that we have, right, your cost risk on the upside of going with Nvidia
Hmm.
is limited, because they're effectively saying you're going to buy a subscription, right? You can use the system as much as you want with this
Hmm.
subscription license. Now, there's certain parameters associated with the subscription license. I'll call it limits, et cetera, with that. But effectively, Nvidia is saying, right, we're going to manage the risk associated with utilization on the subscription license. Part of that makes sense because Nvidia can sit there and say, hey, I got all the chips in the world, I got the capacity to do this thing, this is how we're going to differentiate ourselves. And they're going to differentiate themselves based upon performance, right, because of that chipset that sits underneath that. Now, what makes Nvidia really interesting to me right now is their tool is called Nvidia AI Enterprise. um, and they just created something that was called the Foundry, right? Now,
Hmm.
the Foundry is a tool that you can use in order to be able to train, I'll call it, LLM models. What makes NVIDIA interesting is this: NVIDIA and Meta and Accenture
Hmm.
simultaneously announced the release of a tool set. NVIDIA announced Foundry. Meta
Hmm.
announced Lambda 3.1, which is
Hmm.
a completely open large language model. And
Yeah.
Accenture announced a framework for using that called the Refinery. And the simultaneous announcement of this, of this was, we are going to offer to the market a methodology from Accenture, a open AI, or an open large language model from Meta, and a platform in order to be able to do the work on modifying that open AI large language model on the NVIDIA platform. This
Hmm.
is a play by all three companies to be able to say, we're going to market with an open framework, not a closed framework, and
Yeah.
offer to the industry, right? Kind of the openness of, how did you actually create this Lambda model? What went into this Lambda model? I've got a lot more options for tuning the Lambda model. So it is something, at least from my standpoint, that was really interesting to be able to say, you got three companies jointly offering kind of a comprehensive solution to how I want to be able to go to market with these large language models and the technology.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's always interesting to see, three powerhouse, even two powerhouse companies join together and try to come into the market. And honestly, it seems like a smart move on Nvidia's part when their biggest competition is AWS and Microsoft.
Yeah, I mean, it really does make for I'll call it a differentiated, I'll call it a differentiated offering in that space.
So now I guess moving into Microsoft, their Azure AI, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, a lot. Again, very similar to AWS in this space, right? I mean, they're going to offer strong integration capabilities with the rest of the Microsoft services, as well as the Microsoft Azure platform. But Microsoft, I think, is to a certain extent emphasizing ethical AI and responsible AI usage and compliance. And so their tool sets are more geared toward kind of this concept of responsible AI. And
Hmm.
so if your company is really interested in this whole concept of responsible AI, and if you're in the medical profession, that might make sense that you've got to be able to deal with those things, or
Yeah.
you feel like your company is going to come underneath heavy regulatory restrictions, or you recognize that you are currently under a lot of regulatory restrictions, then maybe this platform serves you better in terms of the
Mhm.
overall compliance. And so, as you're looking at that platform, I think that's going to be an important element there.
So I know as you sort of went through those, you started to talk a little bit about comparing them to one another, talked a little bit about the pricing and cost considerations and those two different models, the pay as you go and the subscription. So is there anything else you want to sort of drive home in terms of how those three compare to each other, what the pricing looks like, anything that, our clients should know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of one of the things that we're recognizing on pricing to begin with is I will say that they all tend to price, with the exception at least of Nvidia, they all tend to price on a pay as you go basis.
Yeah.
With some of them having the capability to also to what I'm going to refer to as reserve instances as well,
Hmm.
meaning reserve your own capacity to a certain extent. Nvidia is much more on subscription, I'll call it,
Hmm.
and enterprise agreements. Um, I think the important thing here is recognizing that these pay as you go models. Um, my fundamental assumption is the cost of inferencing is going to go down on a per unit basis over time,
Hmm.
because the cost of the infrastructure itself is going to go down as additional capacity comes online for the GPUs, and more vendors get involved in
Hmm.
actually creating the GPUs. Now, the cost on a per unit basis is going to go up or going to go down, but consumption of as people deploy their models, inferencing is going to go up.
Hmm.
So you're going to see, I think, greater than a geometric growth in usage costs over time. So as companies begin to think about their agreements, that's what I would be paying attention to. Yeah, I want to be able to drive down my per unit costs, but I want to be able to think about my growth curve, and I want to be able to think about, on that growth curve, am I going to be able to get reductions over time associated with those per unit costs,
Hmm.
from a volume basis. So there's a lot that's going into that. I will tell you that this whole space of pricing is still very, very foggy. And I don't think anybody's going to be out there signing long term agreements right now to be able to say, what am I going to pay for this thing? But it's a pay
Yeah.
as you go model by and large, with the exception of NVIDIA.
Yeah. Awesome. No, I think that's really great. That's a great thing to map out because that's something that prospective customers, as they start to plan out the pricing, it matters.
Right.
That's what they're wondering. So now I know we want to keep this episode sort of shorter to respect our listeners' time. So if we could start by getting into the evaluating and selecting process, and then we actually are going to come out with a white paper that will dive even deeper into the weeds of how you go about evaluating and selecting a provider. So if you could just give like the high level teaser for people as we wrap up the episode.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll get into this a little bit here and say, hey, listen, this is not different than any other big platform that you're buying. Thank God,
Mhm.
from that standpoint, the evaluation criteria is pretty much the same. You're thinking about five things, right? You're thinking about the total cost of ownership. We've already talked about that a bit, right? Thinking about total cost of ownership, at least from my stand, primarily on recognizing that there's going to be I'll call it an increase in the amount of inferencing. That leads
Mhm.
me then to this whole concept of scalability. Are
Mhm.
you going to be able to increase at the rate that you expect to be able to increase with your applications and in this agreement? Or are you going to be stuck in a scenario that says, if you end up going over your limits, it's going to cost you even more? So you've got to be able to
Yeah.
think about, I'll call it, that scalability. Then you've got I'm going to say, flexibility from the standpoint of thinking about, if you're not using all your inferencing, or if you're not using all of your minimums pay as you go, can you actually shift that around and use that in other areas of pricing, for not necessarily in the ML, or in the machine learning area, or in
Mhm.
the AI infrastructure? Can you apply it to other parts of your agreement with those large companies? And then, as we've talked about before, how are you going to integrate that platform? What's going to be the level of integration? What's going to be the cost associated with that integration? And then finally, I'll call it support and services, right? What are you actually buying from these companies? Are you going to get the additional support that goes with it? How are they going to assist you in setting up your environment, manage your environment, et cetera? All of those things go into, I'll call it, the evaluation, but that's not a lot different than most other IT jobs, at least from that standpoint. the
Mhm.
the criteria is very much the same. How you actually think about that criteria might be different, but the criteria is reasonably the same.
Like I said, we'll have a white paper that dives into this, the evaluation and selection more in depth, as well as the other sections that we talked about. It's sort of a good starter pack for companies that are starting to really, evaluate and deploy generative AI platforms moving into 2025. So I think this was a great start. Hopefully, it gives our listeners, a bit of a checklist to work off of as they start to evaluate and deploy. So thank you, John, for this conversation.
All righty, but we'll talk to you
All right.
later, Kylie.
All right. And thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Insights for IT Negotiations. This episode was hosted by John Belden and Kylie Chisholm and produced by Mike Brown. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss a new episode. For more information on IT sourcing and risk management strategies, visit UpperEdge.com and subscribe to our monthly UpperEdge newsletter. Thank you for listening.